WNST Real Series. Why? Because someone has to do it. Luke Jones is Kemosabe and riding shotgun. You can read all of my work and my writings and my remembrances and my rationale and my storytelling and a few of my snarky notes at 25 years into this. But we get to the portion of the programming where this is Buck Showalter's turn, Luke, and I'm going to let you step to the forefront because I tend to run ragged on some of these segments because I do have a lot to say, and it is my show, and it's my chance to sort of go 50-50 with you. But I know you have some thoughts on Buck, and I don't know if Buck's damaged goods, and I know we talked about this as it relates to Dan Duquette and his culpability for all the good and the bad. I will definitely say this, dude. You and I got on some airplane rides to Kansas City, right? You and I rode some trips to New York for games. You and I have talked at length about this in many, many ways, about his contributions and, sort of what his legacy will be. This is the tarnished end of where it is, right? Barry Trotz won't have that in Washington. The last thing Barry Trotz did was raise the cup. He goes to Long Island. It's a different thing. Buck sort of hung around after it didn't go well. And this year will be attached to Buck's record. And Buck always has this thing about the end. But, boy, when things were going well, I mean, there's a lot of things Buck Showalter did to win baseball games here. Never pitched, never hit, right? But put guys in a position to win when they were winning. And all credit to some of those good teams, 11, 12, 13, 14. I give it to Buck. I do. I mean, Buck should own that. But Buck also has to own this. And, Buck also owns that he didn't win. And Buck also owns Zach Britton. But the good and the bad, Buck took a job here no one in the world would take and managed a way to win. And my Dear Buck letter will at least begin with that part of it.
Yeah, and I'll be bullish on this. Buck Showalter, way more good than the bad.
No, yeah.
And I'm not going to completely overlook everything that happened, even from the time that he got here in 2010. Keep in mind, and it's especially prudent to mention this now with the Orioles flirting with a pace that's on par with 1988. That 2010 team was right in that same kind of pacing to win or to lose over 100 games, potentially overtake that 54 and 107 1988 team, and everything changed when Buck got there. Now, in hindsight, when you look back at it, you say, okay, well, it had a lot of young players who hadn't performed up to expectations that year, and maybe they were starting to figure it out, but Showalter was very clearly at least part of the catalyst for getting that going. Now, it didn't pop immediately after that. 2011 was not a good season, but you could see this thing at least turning in a better direction. Now, that said, you and I talking at the beginning of the 2012 season, neither of us were talking about this team winning 93 games.
It kind of happened quickly. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it kind of, there was no build into this thing. It was just sort of one day Gonzalez and Chen looked like number 2 starters, and the defense combined with health, combined with a lot of elements of, still the best of J.J. Hardy and Markakis and Wieters, along with the prime of Davis and Jones and, whatever Blossom Tillman had on him for 20 minutes. And, a lot of good things have to happen at the same time to win 93 games when you're doing it the way they did it, right? Which was not by necessarily always drafting the best players or signing the biggest free agents or having a bunch of Machados, but they had a Machado and they had a couple of death trades that were made that Buck pushed the right buttons. And, they did. Buck inherited some young pitching. I mean, Arrieta went on to win a Cy Young elsewhere. That's part of the story here, too.
Sure.
But he got the most out of that pitching and a lot of that pitching. And, I think that was part of his genius as much as anything else.
And specifically the bullpen. I think as much as you kind of look at it now, and Darren O'Day's been off injured the last couple of years, and same thing with Zach Britton, whether they should have traded him at one point in time or another. But so the shine of the bullpen has kind of worn off over the last couple of years. But you go back to 2012, with Jim Johnson, Darren O'Day was a waiver claim the previous off season, and it kind of built from there, and they had different guys join the picture, and certainly Zach Britton in 2014 you'll look back at that. But you made a point that I wholeheartedly agree with. Buck just seemed to know the right buttons to push. He seemed to know what would make some of these young players tick. I don't think it's any coincidence that you saw a real change in Adam Jones from the time that Buck arrived. And that's not to say that Jones wasn't a really good, young, talented player prior to Showalter getting here, but I think you saw Adam Jones become a leader from that point on. And, it kind of famously they had a conversation shortly after Showalter arrived where, the gist of it was, Adam, I kind of need you to be the guy on the field for me. And Adam Jones, youthful as he was, wanted to ask questions of Buck, wanted to know what he thought about certain scenarios, and from an early time, those two clicked. So I think that relationship between manager and player set the tone for everything else that started happening on the field, and it ended up being a very, very positive situation. And they never got to a World Series, and you can look at the last few years, and it definitely takes some of the shine off of the overall. When you consider where this team was for the longest time, and that's not to say that every manager that came through here was incompetent. Mike Hargrove was a good manager. So, who knows? Dave Tremblay in a better situation with better players might have been a competent manager. Sam Perlazzo, who knows? But you just go down the list. So many guys had really had no chance to do well here, and I think back to the possibility of Bobby Valentine and Joe Girardi and some of the names that were out there, guys that kind of ended up in the end scoffing.
Remember, La Russa was banging around organizations looking for. Joe Torre was banging. There were all sorts of, Theo Epstein has moved around here. If something competent was going on here, you know what I mean? Like, we just write these guys off and say, well, CeCe Sabathia never would have pitched here. Teixeira never would have signed here. I mean, that's where this whole thing begins with why it has sucked for so long with Peter running it, is because for the most part, competent people would not choose to come here, and Buck bucked that tradition, and he was the one guy who still had a level of credibility of some kind, who brought some level of credibility here when it was bereft of credibility. Other than, McPhail had credibility, but McPhail certainly wasn't going to get a gig in most places because he probably wasn't the cup of tea of a lot of these owners because of how much power he wanted and how much, I guess Angelos at that point wanted to say, I need somebody else, something else here. That was McPhail, but after Flanagan killed himself and McPhail went out the side door and Buck's here with a bunch of players that clearly had talent, finding a manager that wanted to come in here and take this thing over, as you've pointed out, there are a lot of, quad A guys that would have taken the job, and the Gabe Kapler types. I mean, Rick Dempsey would have crawled on broken glass to Ocean City to have a chance to be called the skipper and all of that stuff. But, it's not a gig that Cal Ripken wanted or Bill Ripken wanted to come running down to the warehouse and babysit, the Angelos boys and the circumstances that have changed so much that we're talking about because Brady Anderson wasn't in this picture when Buck came in. And then it's meet Brady. He's friends with the boys. They hang out over at the Four Seasons. Get to know him. You'll be seeing a lot of him around here. He'll be reporting to ownership. Well, what's my role? Well, you're going to manage a team. Oh, a lot of things have happened here to make this thing start to smell like, last week's fish, really. I mean, and Buck has not thrown anybody over the boat. He's the good soldier and all that, but, the question mark really here really is first day out the building, Buck's exit going to look a little bit like Barry Trotz's last week, which is, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I'll see you later.
Yeah, and I think that's the big question now. But, just to kind of speak to and reference our conversation about Dan Duquette, that really was the turning point as far as the flirtation with Toronto because I think, Buck's I'll say this much. And look, I've been a Buck Showalter guy for most of the duration of his tenure, even though I think at this point in time, by no means do I think he's become an idiot overnight or anything like that. As much as it's tough to to see through that when you have a team that's 30 games under 500. But I think it's time to move on and start fresh. But one of the things about Buck Showalter, and this has been from day one, he's very good at playing the game. He's very good at, and I don't want to say manipulating people because I think that always carries a negative connotation, but I think he has a good way of relating to people, making them feel valued, whether he values that person's opinion to the degree that he plays off or not. I think he's been good at doing that with a number of individuals, inside the organization. I think.
Well, obviously good. Dempsey, loves him now after being appalled that they would bring in this guy that failed in 3 places to ever win, and did enough to. When he left, they won.
Right.
That's a hell of a thing to say. Is when you left the building is when we won a championship. I mean, and I'm going to continue to turn it back to Barry Trotz and turn it back to our partner Brian Billick here, where the Trent Dilfer thing and these major shakeups and things happen. I don't think this place is necessarily going to get better after Buck Showalter's gone. I mean, I'll say that. I mean, I don't think he was part of the problem, quite frankly, at all. And if I'm going to say that Barry Trotz will be smarter on Long Island, and he would say that, I would say Buck Showalter will be smarter in whatever studio he goes and sits for having had this experience. And it would be very, very telling to know, and we'll never know, much like we'll never know with McPhail. All these guys are kayfabe in the end, aren't they? Kind of, sort of, right? Like, literally. They're kayfabe from a wrestling standpoint. We'll never, ever know just how screwed up the place was, because relating to people, making them feel valued, all of that stuff, that's something the ownership's not been good at. And once he goes out the side door, the guy they could prop up after they lose 26-10, or after they start the season 3-16, or whatever, they got to find the next guy. And that guy's not named Angelos or Anderson or whatever, because those people haven't been accountable human beings all along. I don't expect Brady Anderson to have an ego transplant and stand out in front of this thing and relate to people at Costas Inn. You know what I mean? Like, I don't. But I don't know who's going to do that, but somehow Buck did. Buck had that all shucks thing that when things were going well, we all had our buckled up shirts and all that stuff, and he channeled Earl Weaver. I mean, and I say that as a guy that watches him on TV. I mean, I don't know Buck Showalter, but there's something that was very relatable about him to the fan base they attracted when they were winning. And that's going to be gone, much like it's gone in D.C. right now with Trotz, and you're going to have to figure that out. And then you're going to have to figure out the leadership and all that. But there is a part of this, and I want to say all of our WNST programming brought to you by our friends at Royal Farms. I want to give a shout out there because we're getting a little long-winded here on all this stuff. And make sure you get out there and get the app, and you're using that, watching the Justin Tucker commercials, which I hope to air here at WNST at some point as well. And I've been doing some social media, eating some fried chicken as well. Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast. Of course, the Royal Farms Arena, a big part of my life as summer concert series here go on. But, Luke, I want to get on to Buck and the future and what happens when that leadership walks out the door is how do you replace Buck, right? Like, we're still talking about Buck replacing Earl Weaver. There's 7 other managers in between there, right? Before the thing got any good with a Davey Johnson stop and a nod to Joe Altobelli and all that stuff. But, there's all these other... The next thing that happens here, I don't know how this is an attractive job to anyone, right? I mean, that's part of the problem is what's left in the cupboard, because if Buck stays on and now we're talking fantasy land, and we were allowed to do that because who knows, right? Who knows how he really feels and what other opportunities are out there. But whatever this thing is on October the 1st and into the winter, it's not a good situation here, one way or another. And it's a little bit of a scorched earth thing that I don't think will stick to Buck, but I think it sticks to someone's going to manage the team next April, and that person's probably not going to be as good at doing this as Buck Showalter.
Yeah, and that's where you find yourself in a tough situation as an organization beyond all the other issues that are above this current topic that we're talking about. I mean, look, you can have the best manager in the world. You need to have players. Buck Showalter didn't win with the talent level that was what the Orioles were in 2002. they had talented players, and that's not to knock him. It's to show that all of those factors need to be there. Now,
I had Sam Perlazzo sit in the dugout when I was doing my book 7-8 years ago down in Orlando and say, I didn't have enough good players. I mean, literally, he just said, I didn't have enough good players. And I think we can go back and look and see where the Yankees were, where the Red Sox were, and how they played them 40 times a year and say they didn't have enough good players. And I think anybody can look at this and say, you don't have enough good players. I related a little bit to Trotz because he's looked at the island and said, well, at least they have Tavares. Around here, what do you say? At least they have Bundy? At least I'll be running it. At least I'm happy to have a managerial job, or the things that Dan Duquette was saying. I don't know where Buck would have managed had he not taken this gig. You take your hat off and go back in time and say how many. But if you're willing to take this job, maybe you're willing to take any job. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, look, we can sit here all day and talk about the genesis of him taking the job, but, he's been here a long time, and he, as we already said, did more good than bad, I think, and I think anyone who disputes that, I think you're really selling short the first, the 5 years of the Duquette Showalter era and putting, too much, because it's what's happening now on the end. But that said, in the case of Buck Showalter, there's plenty of good, and you alluded to this, and I think we've gotten deep enough in the conversation where we have to come back to this point. I mentioned a little bit Duquette with the flirtation with Toronto, and from that point on, maybe Buck started having a little more roster influence than he did prior to that. We can debate how good that is. Certainly, there's questions as far as how Showalter evaluates talent, which I think is interesting as it relates to if by chance he does stay in the organization, what is his role, what is his capacity. But I go back to the wild card game. And I think
it's nice that we've given Buck 17 minutes, literally, without even bringing that up, right? Like, we haven't said the word Jimenez, we haven't said the word Britton. We have shown Buck the love. I just want to make sure that when people come in on the backside, they just put the radio on right now at where we're going over what's happened here over the last 2 years, right? Like how this thing's unraveled.
And as we're sitting here talking right now, I pulled up at WNST.net what I wrote in the wee hours of the morning following that game in Toronto. And the headline was very simply, Showalter lets down when the Orioles needed him the most. And that's what it came down to. And I really feel like, even though you could certainly talk about, the shift as far as, Duquette having more control prior to the flirtation with Toronto, and from that point on, maybe Buck starting to have more influence than he did before, and Brady Anderson, and that whole dynamic that we talked about in our Duquette conversation. But you point to the wild card game. That's when Buck lost the aura that he had carried here as coach, as manager, as someone that you felt, man, this guy just seems to get everything he can out of this team. When you look at 12, you look at 2013, 2014, 2016. I mean, he always seemed to, the sum of the parts always seemed to be better than any of these parts in isolation. And that's not to say there wasn't talent, but there was always the argument to say, are the Orioles in 2014, are they really a 96-win team if someone other than Buck Showalter is managing them?
No.
And who knows, maybe they would have been. But he carried that aura. There was a mystique to him here in Baltimore, regardless of knocks on him elsewhere. And, it's not as though he managed perfectly every single night. You can pick apart any managerial
Well, it was
decision.
starting to feel like it was his time at some point to make something happen. And I think for anybody that doesn't put yourself back into the time and the space, if they win that game, they can win the World Series, right? They had the capability, as we've seen with the Capitals, as we've seen with any baseball team that can catch fire at that particular time, from the Royals to the Giants to, who did it routinely, quite frankly, in having bouts with mediocrity and doubts and all of that stuff that puts it together in October. Certainly for an Orioles team that had been bounced a couple of times, they had some seasoning that if Britton comes in there and pitches 3 scoreless innings and Davis, wouldn't have been Davis, anybody, would have been Davis that year, whomever, Adam Jones, anybody gets a hold of one and you win that game, the door opens for a parade around here, and that's the what if. and leaving your best pitcher on the pine is just – that's going to stick to him, right? I mean,
sure.
and the next job, and getting to that part where do the Orioles go, where does Buck go? You know, how do you deliver him to your fan base in City X? I mean, he's already been delivered to the Yankees, the Rangers, the Diamondbacks, the Orioles, right? I mean, I don't know how the next team hires him and says, well, he did finish, 57 and 109 in Baltimore that last year. And, he had Jimenez in the game in Toronto. Remember that? You can't hire that guy. Oh, and he's not a real believer in sabermetrics, but been around the game a long time. He's a good baseball man. I have no doubt about that. I don't know how you hire that guy, given the kind of guys that have been getting hired lately, right? It would take a unique circumstance, I think.
Now, the last point you just made, given guys that have been hired lately, when you're seeing this shift, and it's been a very clear shift in how organizations are operating, where for the longest time it's always kind of been considered general manager, even though the GM, in a vacuum, and I'm talking normal situations, not where you have a muddy chain of command, as we've talked about with what's been going on here the last couple of years.
It's not muddy, it's unorthodox. Marty Conway told me that.
Right, but in your typical settings, we often view general manager and field manager, or general manager and head coach, as more of a partnership, even though it's really not. That's how we view it. We don't really think, in many contexts, even though Ozzie Newsome, yes, is John Harbaugh's boss, we still have viewed them on kind of a level field. And that's kind of the traditional way that you view it. But major league organizations in baseball in 2018, you're really seeing a shift from that, where the GM, president of baseball operations, whatever your official title is, it's seen much more as you run the entire show, and the field manager is much more considered a middle-of-the-pack management that is carrying out ideas, strategies, notions, sabermetric trends, all of those things, a data-driven strategy, and really that manager is an arm of the general manager. So from that context, I agree with you on Buck Showalter. From a context of this season being so terrible, and it is, and there's no way to sugarcoat it, and Buck has to wear that in the same way that every single player, front office member, ownership, everyone, top to bottom, has to wear it. But I think he's also built up a lot of credit. I think he's made a lot of good, positive deposits over the years, especially because I think the Orioles, as far as how the rest of baseball views them, they've been however you want to categorize them, a sleeping giant, done less with more as far as resources in the past. It's very clear they haven't been viewed favorably for 20 years now. There's no question about that. So I still think people look at what the Orioles were from 12 through 16, and I think Buck Showalter should get a lot of credit for that. Now, does that mean he gets a job next year as a manager? And let me throw this out there. He said on a number of occasions he doesn't have any plans to manage anywhere else after his time's up in Baltimore. I mean, he's in his early 60s. Could he manage elsewhere? Sure. Do I think it's possible another team would give him another chance? Maybe after a year off, maybe you get a year removed from the stench of this season? Sure. Do I think that's going to happen? I think it's going to be really interesting in that regard. I mean, look, Buck still has a lot of friends in TV. I know the other, even in a recent pregame press conference was citing one of the Orioles draft picks and referenced what Harold Reynolds was saying about him. So it's clear he still has relationships going back to his ESPN days. Buck could get a TV job at ESPN or MLB Network or wherever immediately if he wanted to do that. So I don't know if the door is completely closed.
Life's good like that, by the way. He had that life for a little while, but that's life without winning. But, I mean, he's also made several $1 million here and had some fun and made some friends and done some good and taken some chances and lived that life again, and I think the next 3 months are going to be hard on him.
This season has been hard on him. I mean, I think for as much as people look at what's said publicly to the media and pre- and post-game press conferences, losing's tough on these individuals, and I'm not making excuses. This isn't Little League. This is a pass-fail business, and the stakes are high, and the money is lucrative. So I'm not going to apologize for anyone in that regard, but this has been a tough season for him.
Well, as you say with Buck, he would say the want is there. He would say that, literally, right?
I mean, it's not like the Orioles rolled the ball out on opening day and, Adam Jones hits the walk-off and they beat the Twins, and then they say, well, that's enough good feeling for this year. That's not how this works. I mean, but what impact does this season have on him from a short-term impact? I've said all along, and even when you and I talked a couple months ago about this, even when this team was sitting at whatever their record was 20 games in, but it was clear it wasn't trending in the right direction immediately. At that point, I was still confident that Buck Showalter, if you're talking him or Duquette, he was going to be the one that had a much, much, much better chance of sticking around if he wanted to. And I think ownership wanted him to stick around. Now, I don't think it's a 0% chance that he returns. I don't think the door is closed on him in the way that I feel that Duquette, the writing's been on the wall for a couple years now. But I'm certainly not remotely certain or confident that he's going to be back. And even if he would be, what would that capacity be? Would it be him continuing to be field manager? What kind of influence would he have beyond that? Does he want some more influence as far as the roster goes? Would you want to give him that? Because some of the guys that he lobbied to have over the last couple years, as I said, him having a little more influence than he did maybe early on in his tenure, didn't work out. He's been a Chris Tillman guy. He's been a Colby Rasmus guy, to use a very recent example. He was a guy that really wanted Andrew Kashner. And, Kashner's been okay. Colby Rasmus has been hurt and was terrible before that. Chris Tillman's been an utter disaster, despite what he was at one point for this team. So, from that standpoint, just using a few players, there's not exactly a great track record for Buck from a player evaluation standpoint if you're putting on a GM hat or some kind of front.
Well, he had his guys, right? So if I'm taking notes on all this, by the way, Luke Jones is joining us here to reset everything. You can find him at Baltimore Luke. He is Luke at WNST.net. Of course, our Orioles historian and insider and blogger and writer and coverer and newsbreaker and all that good stuff. We are in the Dear Orioles series. All of it brought to you by our friends at Cole Roofing and ColeRoofing.com, as well as our friends at Pfister Energy. You hear Bill Cole and I talking some Dear Orioles here this week, next week, as we lead up to the All-Star game later on in the summer. Also, our friends at King Discount Liquors. I was over Costas Inn the other night with the Free the Bird shirts. I still have a handful of those left. You can email me. And a woman said, I saw you on the King Discount Liquors commercial with a Free the Bird shirt. I need a Free the Bird shirt. So, lottery, beer, booze, and the best prices in Baltimore. King Discount Liquors. Give the King a ring. Also, our friends at Box Hill Pizzeria. I was up in Hartford County. They are finishing up the remodeling. I promise you we're going to be up there with pictures and crab cakes and salad and dressing. I'm running low on dressing. Tell somebody sees Tommy or Chris, let them know I need some salad dressing down here. Box Hill Pizzeria, boxhillpizzeria.com. It's not really pizzeria. It's a crab cakeria, bigger and better than ever. Box Hill Pizzeria. All right, Luke, I wanted to say this because I wrote a little note and said, Buck's had his guys, right? Which goes back to Pierce. It goes back to Flaherty. I think Gonzalez was one of his guys. At least I thought that until $5 million was on the line. Chris Davis is one of his guys, I think, which is why he keeps coming back, and Davis could let the whole organization down at the most tender point and still get a $161 million deal. I don't think Buck went into Peter and said, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. I think Buck thought, hey, it's your money, dude. I need to win. So, yeah, that's a little talent evaluation issue there that I don't know that anybody ran into the old man and tried to pump the brakes on $161 million, right?
Yeah, and I've heard varying stories on that from different people. I mean, we all know it was ownership-driven. Now, that part of this story is completely obvious. I think the consensus is that Dan Duquette would have preferred allocating those resources elsewhere. And, I've kind of heard different stories on Buck. And, this kind of goes back to the point I made a little bit earlier in the conversation. Buck is very good at
Buck's not a liberal or a conservative. He's not a Republican or he's just he's just down. He's just a good old boy, and whatever you say, I got you.
Here's the way to say it without making it sound like a negative, because I think it's a positive in some instances. he's very good at playing the game from a politics standpoint. So I've heard some people that I've talked to over the years said he was much more in favor of keeping Davis, and I've heard some people say that he was more hesitant, maybe not as hesitant as Duquette, but he was more on that camp. I think it's, to me, it's pretty apparent that he was certainly more in favor of bringing back Davis than Duquette ever was, based on talking to different people and hearsay and what this person said and what player.
Well, a lot of times with the old man over 25 years, it's sort of who gets in his ear last and best, right? Like, it is a persuasion game around him, and right now Brady Anderson's winning everything because that's just where it is. I mean, I don't know what else to say. I mean, I've never heard anybody say Brady's not getting what Brady wants. And, I've got 6 or 7 moles inside the organization, and I think there's very little doubt that nothing's happening around there without Brady being involved in some way. So, that says to me that he is currently the loudest voice. I mean, look, when Frank Wren was running the place, Sid Thrift was the loudest voice. When Sam Perlazzo came in, Rick Dempsey was one of the loudest voices, right? Before that, Mike Flanagan was one of the loudest voices, which is how he got the gig, right? So there's always been this sort of closet person, and I don't know where Buck is in all of that, but I mean, Buck can read the tea leaves and see he's not that guy. He's not the ultimate decision maker because he knows what that looks like because he was that guy in Arizona.
Right, and to be clear, he shouldn't be the ultimate decision maker as the field manager, in the same way that John Harbaugh shouldn't be the ultimate decision maker for the Ravens. I mean, that's where we go back to the necessity of having a chain of command. Yes, converse. Yes, share opinions, and we've talked about this. No front office is going to be harmonious from a standpoint of you're not going to have disagreements. If you don't have disagreements, you probably have a lousy front office because then you have one person who just has a bunch of yes men, and that's all it is. So that's not good either. But at the end of the day, it needs to be one person making that decision. And I'll kind of go back to we talked about the future as far as whether there's any possibility of Showalter being back, and I think there's still that possibility. But then we go back to, is that what's best for the organization? You're going to bring in somebody. I don't think the infrastructure next year is going to be Brady Anderson, general manager, and whoever the manager is. I think there's going to be someone brought in some capacity, whether it's another Dan Duquette retread type, or whether it's someone young that is going to kind of follow orders. I don't know, but we go back to whoever that person is that's brought in. Is it right that they're saddled with the same field manager who's been here a really long time? Again, it goes back to what makes sense, what they should do, rather than what you expect them to do, and that's where this gets muddied. But, I mean, it's just it's tough because in the case of Buck Showalter, we talked a little bit about this in our conversation with about Dan Duquette. You look at all the good, you look at how successful it was, despite some of the challenges, despite the history in this organization. But then you look at where it is now and what it's deteriorated to in a very quick, very short period of time. And that's where I continue to go back to, how do you really separate the stench of what they are right now and deodorize Buck Showalter enough to make it feel like it's a good idea for him to carry on beyond this season with the Orioles? That's where I still go back to, it's time to make a clean break. And I think in hindsight, the wild card game was kind of the beginning of the end in a lot of ways for this team, as far as what happened there at the end of what was an 89-win season, a good season. But it's just they haven't been able to recapture that same magic, and that's again. You look back at that point in time, and that's where Buck kind of lost his mojo. And something we haven't touched on too much, but it's various people have discussed this publicly. Not that any players have put a quote to their name, but Buck definitely lost some influence in the clubhouse after that happened, and understandably so. The players saw the same thing we did watching from home.
He lost it with the media and with the fan base. I mean, that's just such an obvious.
Sure. But it's important to note. I mean, it's important to note that, from that point on, and look, that's not to say, I don't think it's been a case where the clubhouse has been cancerous, for lack of a better term, or that Buck has been completely tuned out. I don't think it's to that dramatic degree, but it goes back to what I said. Buck had this aura to him, this mystique to him that even if every move didn't work out, it still was what was best. And sometimes you make the right move and it just doesn't work out. That doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. The other team tries too. But I think from that point on, the shine really started to come off. And, they started out well last year. They had the 22-10 start to begin 2017. But since then, it's just really deteriorated. And from about September 3rd on from last season, it's been an utter disaster. And I think Buck has to wear his part of that. There's no question about it. And I think ultimately it's why I have the opinion now that I think it's time to start fresh across the board.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke, and Luke at WNST.net. We'll call this a report card on Buck Showalter. All of it brought to you by our friends at Compass Point. Summertime, you need to get out and hit the golf ball. If that's what you do, this is your time of the year. Pasadena, 36 holes they got down there for you at Compass Point. Robert Kennedy joins us here each and every week talking golf and a little college basketball, too, with the Kevin Huerter situation getting drafted the other night. But you can find them at Compass Point Golf. They're doing night golf again later on this month, and they have the world's largest golf outing on August 6th. CompassPointGolf.com, the way to find them. I've talked about Michael's Cafe. We had head coach Barry Trotz up with us back in March telling us how he's going to go win the Stanley Cup, and then did. Boy, the crab cakes are unbelievable. The split-level soup, incredible. My wife and I found a brunch up there on last Saturday. We were up at Hart Road doing some stuff with our facility at WNST. Michael's Cafe has music out on the deck, and they have a fantastic outdoor patio. If you haven't been out there, stop by, say hello. They're always doing great things there. It's Michael's Cafe. Been doing it for 34 years. It is our 20th anniversary on August the 3rd. And this summer we are presenting our Dear Orioles series. I'm writing a series of letters to individuals in the organization. As a precursor to that, we have the audio version, which is what you're hearing right now. You can hear all of them up in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device. On the website, download podcast, listen when you want, where you want, how you want. It is the buyatoyota.com audio vault. Of course, you can find me, Nasty, at WNST.net all summer long. As I write this series, read this series, talk about all these issues, you certainly can join in at Dear Orioles, the hashtag, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook, as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. And by all means, if, when, shall the Orioles trade Manny Machado, you'll get it first on the WNST Tech Service. It's all brought to you by our friends at Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Dennis Colatzos will be here each and every Thursday all summer long with the SSV on WNST. That's heard from 3 until 5. I am a part of that. Luke's a part of that as well when he's not vacationing. I'm not vacationing this summer. I'm a working man, just like Geddy Lee said on the shirt. It's Major League Baseball, It's my Rush reference there. Marathon. It's not how fast you can go, the force that goes into the flow. Lots of Orioles inertia this summer as they atrophy, and we continue to try to figure out how it will ever get better. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.